You know what gets better with age? Wine. You know what doesn't get better with age? A 14-year-old mini PC chassis. Apple. But fortunately, as of today, that is no longer a problem because not only did Apple upgrade the Mac Mini with the new M4 chip from the iPad Pro and also the M4 Pro chip, which we hadn't seen that moniker on the M4 yet, but we also now have a brand new chassis design and a few other things that make it kind of tempting for me. So let's talk about it. Now, before we get into the big thing, which is obviously the redesign of a 14-year-old chassis, I want to talk about what's actually inside this thing because we have the new M4 chip, which actually really isn't that new. We've had it in the iPad Pro now for a little while, and we just got it in the iMac yesterday, which I was going to put all of the announcements from this week into one video and kind of make it at the end of the week, but this takes precedence. So if you want a video with my thoughts on the iMac, stick around till the end of the week, maybe subscribe so you don't miss it. But I want to talk about the internals, not so much the M4, because that's a known quantity. We've got 4 performance cores, 6 efficiency cores, which makes 10 cores total if you can do math. I can't do that so well, so I'm reading off the website. We have a 10-core GPU, as well as hardware-accelerated ray tracing, a 16-core neural engine, and 120 gigabits per second on the memory bandwidth, as well as a couple other little things here and there like the hardware accelerated video encoding, as well as decoding for AV1. Lots of really cool little things in there. That's really not new because the iPad Pro has it, but the big one is the M4 Pro. This is the first computer that Apple decided to release the Pro version of the M4 chip with, and that comes with 12 CPU cores in total, with 8 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores, so they're obviously focusing on performance over efficiency, which makes sense for a Pro chip. And we also have 6 more GPU cores, with 16 total instead of 10, and we have the same hardware accelerated ray tracing and 16-core neural engine, but we do have over double the memory bandwidth with 273 gigabits per second instead of 120. And in my opinion, those specs sound pretty good, and they sound even better when you realize that that is the binned version of the M4 Pro, because you can actually bump it up to a 14-core CPU and a 20-core GPU. That is pretty epic. So that right there was pretty tempting for me just because the chipset selection is really solid. We've already seen how good the M4 can be inside the iPad Pro, but now imagine how good it can be when A, it's got a proper operating system to run on like macOS, and B, it's got a good cooling system unlike the iPad Pro. Apple was actually pretty proud to show off their new cooling solution for the Mac Mini. But the other thing that was really tempting for me was the new base RAM configuration, which was 16 gigs of RAM, what it should have been probably 4 to 5 years ago, but, you know, I guess better late than never. For anyone who doesn't know or who's new here to the channel, I was an early adopter of the Apple Silicon platform. I bought the first Mac that they converted over to the Apple Silicon platform with the M1 Mac Mini. I bought a base version of it, and I ran my channel off of it for several months before switching to the 16 gigabyte version of the same Mac Mini with the M1 chip. I actually made an entire video, which I think is still the most popular video on this channel, called I Bought 2 Mac Minis, Here's Why. And if you didn't know, the base configuration of the M1 Mac Mini was 8 gigabytes of RAM. And something Apple doesn't really talk about much is how unified memory works in the grand scheme of things. Here's what I mean. With unified memory, it's very different from what a lot of people think of when they think of RAM in a computer, because when you put RAM into something like a gaming PC, you're connecting it to a slot. That's a point of contact. It has to run through traces on the board. That's another point of contact, technically, where it has to run that data through those lines. Whereas with unified memory, while it is soldered to the board, which I know a lot of people are not a big fan of, it's not just soldered to the board, but it is basically a part of the chipset. So it is extremely fast. In fact, the full speed that you can get out of something like a high-end Mac Studio or Mac Pro is faster than what you can get out of a DDR4 and even some newer DDR5 DIMM sets. So it is incredibly fast memory, which is why the system uses it not just for system memory, but also graphics memory. And this is where the minimum of 8 gigabytes of RAM becomes a problem for some users. Actually, not even for some users, it could be a problem for anybody, because if you're doing something where you have, let's say, a lot of tabs open on your computer, and you're a Chrome user and not a Safari user, you are going to run out of memory by just using system memory. Then let's say you open up something that requires, let's be generous and say 900 megabytes of video memory. Well, suddenly your computer has to figure out where to get that 900 megabytes from because the system is using all of it. So it has to take something that maybe isn't currently in use or isn't at the forefront of what you're doing, and it has to push it off onto the SSD, which not only wears out the SSD, though not as much as some other YouTubers might have you think, and the SSD is considerably slower than RAM. So you now have that graphics task going and your system is still using the rest of the RAM, and then you go to access the thing that got dumped to the SSD. Well, now it has to pull it from the SSD, it's slower, and you will notice it as a user. So bumping up to 16 gigabytes of RAM now means that if you're using something that takes up 8 gigabytes of RAM, you still have 8 left for, if you wanted to, all video, which is freaking awesome. Anyway, that's my little rant aside. It is super nice that Apple has finally given you 16 gigabytes of RAM at the base configuration, and they haven't raised the price. It is still $599, which is cheaper than what I bought my Mac Mini for with 8 gigabytes of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, which, by the way, this also still comes with 256 gigs of storage, which I think for a lot of users who are just going to use this as like, you know, grandma's tax return machine, I think it'll be fine. For me, I use mine as a Plex server now, so all the stuff that goes onto it is going to an external drive. However, Plex does tend to use a decent amount of RAM, so that's again why that extra RAM is rather tempting. Hey, Editor Garrett hopping in here real quick. I did focus on the new base configuration of the RAM, which is 16 gigabytes, but depending on the chipset you choose, you can go from 16 to 24 to 32 to 48 to 64. Now, 24, 48, and 64 are just for the M4 Pro lineup, but if you want to go with the base configuration, you can still go with 16, 24, or 32. Pretty awesome options now, especially considering you're not locked into 24 as the maximum on the base M series chips. So awesome stuff. I fixated a lot on the 16 gigabyte base because that's what I'm looking to buy, but the fact that you can go higher with that is super nice, though it is still Apple pricing. So keep that in mind. 64 gigs will run you $600. Oof. Anyway, back to the content. And the last thing that's tempting, is we're finally going to talk about it, is the size, the redesign. Finally! This Mac Mini, for what Apple's put inside of it, is a properly tiny computer. It's 5 inches by 5 inches by 2 inches tall, and that is properly small for a computer like this, especially considering what Apple's saying they can get out of it. I mean, the M4 Pro version can run 3 displays. We could only run 2 off of the base Mac Mini, so that's pretty cool to add another display, and not just any display, but their studio display. That's pretty epic. Now, looking at the pictures of the front of this thing, there's also a black dot next to the power light, and me being the old Apple computer collector I am, for a brief second, I thought that maybe it was the IR receiver coming back, but it's actually a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack. So I guess for a computer this small, that does make sense to have it on the front because it's probably just gonna be sitting somewhere on your desk because that's just what mini PCs do. And according to the photography that they're doing for the marketing, it's very clearly meant to just sit on your desk. But either way, you have a headphone jack, which is more than you can say about modern smartphones. Around the back, you have gigabit Ethernet that can also be bumped up to 10 gigabit Ethernet, which is pretty cool, as well as an HDMI port and 3 USB 4 ports that support, of course, Thunderbolt 4. But if you get the M4 Pro chip, you can also use Thunderbolt 5. For anybody who doesn't know the difference, USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4 both run at 40 gigabits per second, which is still incredibly fast. The only difference between Thunderbolt and USB is, of course, Universal Serial Bus versus Thunderbolt being a trademark of Intel. Thunderbolt 5, however, is 120 gigabits per second. Now, there are only a few products on the market right now that support it, but the fact that you have it on the M4 version, that is wild. Kind of has me wondering what's going to be on the MacBook Pros, the Mac Studios, and the Mac Pros coming up in the next few days, but I guess we'll see. Either way, Thunderbolt 5 is now available just on the rear, but you might have noticed something as I was pointing to the front and the back of this computer, which is the power button. Where's the power button? Well, I'm assuming Apple thinks that people either like turning their computers on with their pinky, or I'm vastly underestimating how tall this thing is, because the power button is under the back side of the computer. So you gotta kind of reach behind it and press it from the bottom. But also, I realize doing this gesture is kind of weird. I feel like a doctor. Let me put my gloves on, or I bend over and cough. Okay, that's enough wine for me. Anyway, I just think it's kind of odd because it seems like Apple wants you to lift the computer up, press the power button, and set it back down, or they just don't really think you're going to turn this computer off that often, which is a fair assumption. I don't remember the last time I turned off my Mac Mini. It just kind of sits there running my server, and that's nice because without having to go with something like a Mac Pro, I don't have to power cycle my computers as frequently as you would want to with something like an Intel platform. So maybe that's what they're assuming, or again, they're just assuming you're going to pick it up, press the button, and set it back down, or tip it forward and press it. I don't know. Maybe if I get one of these, which I'm very tempted to, I will figure out what their intention is with this power button placement. But anyway, this Mac Mini is very tempting for me because it's basically what I've been asking Apple to do to the Mac Mini since they moved it to Apple Silicon, because the Apple Silicon board, if you've ever looked at a teardown, takes up half the space of the entire chassis. This 14-year-old chassis, and I keep saying that because it's just mind-blowing that they kept it around this long. But the Mac Mini motherboard in the Mac Mini chassis took up half the space of the entire 14-year-old chassis. The only reason they kept it that size was because they reused the same power supply from the Intel Mac Minis, and that power supply was long. It ran the whole length of that chassis. So the motherboard obviously had a ton of room to breathe, but the power supply took up the rest of that length. Now they have finally taken advantage of the efficiency of those chips and put it into something compact that just really utilizes that efficiency and puts it into something tiny. I am so happy about that. So again, tempted by it, especially considering it's the same $599 price tag, and my base Mac Mini still actually gets a pretty good trade-in value. I don't know, what do you all think? Let me know down in the comments if you'd be interested in me doing another video about a Mac Mini. Obviously, I'd be buying the base configuration because 16 gigabytes of RAM for something like a Plex server is more than enough, and of course I'll use it for a couple tests here and there to see how M1 has improved from then till now with M4, and actually, now that I think about it, yeah, I have M1 everything. M1 Mac Mini, M1 iPad, M1 Mac Studio, so yeah, I have not actually tried any of the new Apple Silicon stuff. So let me know what you all think. Would you be interested in me doing this? Of course, let me know in the comments. 16 gigs of RAM is finally nice, 256 gigs of storage, whatever, M4 chip with the newer graphics, all that fun stuff. Either way, that has been it. I'm going to cut myself off now before I start ranting. Again, let me know what you all think in the comments. Let me know if you think I should do this in the comments. And let me know your thoughts of the Mac Mini itself. Are you finally glad that they got rid of that 14-year-old chassis? Do you not care? Is it tempting for you? Let me know. All that stuff down in the comment section below. And on your way down there, if you like this video, definitely leave it a like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Again, I'm going to be doing some kind of mashup video at the end of the week of all these computers together. So maybe subscribe for that as well. But aside from that, thank you all so much for being here, and I will see you in the next video. Make sure to be there and have a good one.